Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today as we speak to this very important topic. Now, before we dive into introductions and our presentation, I wanted to run through a couple of logistical items for today's webinar. Firstly, this webinar will be recorded and a link to the recording available after today's discussion for you to share with individuals in your network who may not have been able to attend. In addition, we will be taking questions at the end of today's discussion. I ask that you put those questions into the Q&A box that you'll find located at the bottom of your screen. And with that, let's get started with some introductions. Marion, if you wanted to start us off.
Sure. Thanks, Evangeline. A pleasure to be here with you, and welcome to those joining us online. My name is Marion Gaid. I'm the Vice President of External Relations and Partnerships here at NorQuest College. I'm also a member of the Women Executive Network Diversity Council and a member of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce BIPOC Leadership and Inclusion Council. Within our beautiful province here, I actually chair a number of boards, two not-for-profit boards, E4C and Firefly Theatre and Circus. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today and really setting a brave and safe space for this conversation. I lead here from where I am. I'm not an expert, but I do have lived experiences as a Copt Indigenous to the lands of North Africa and as an immigrant to this land as a teenager. So my knowledge and experiences really stem from my sponsorship of this work in our own organization, NorQuest, as well as supporting our community organizations in paving their own path in this space. So thanks, and really looking forward to be here with you. I would love, of course, to start off by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of Métis Region Number 4. This land is home to many diverse groups of Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Sioux, Nakota Sioux, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that the City of Edmonton and all the people here are beneficiaries of Treaty Number 6, which encompasses the traditional territories of numerous Western First Nations, as well as Métis people who have called these lands home since time immemorial. NorQuest and I also acknowledge the treaty, the land and the territories of Indigenous peoples, as a reminder of our responsibility and obligations to the land and to Indigenous peoples, and as a reminder of our accountability to address the ongoing impacts of colonization that are distinct to Indigenous peoples and communities. And finally, it's a reminder for us to work together in remembering the spirit and intent of the treaty towards right relations. I'd love to start us off by sharing some definitions around the space of equity, diversity, and inclusion, as language used in this space is really quite important and critical. And the definitions that I'm using here today are derived from thought leaders in the space that are aligned with our philosophy and values at NorQuest. And I recognize that different organizations may use different definitions. And so please know that this is very specific to how NorQuest currently defines it in alignment to thought leadership in the community. For us, equity is really about fairness and justice. It's about taking deliberate actions to remove systemic, group, and individual barriers and obstacles that hinder opportunities and disrupt our well-being. Equity is achieved through the identification and elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that create and reinforce unfair outcomes. It is different from equality, and I know a lot of you probably heard about this. Although both of them promote fairness, equality achieves this through treating everyone the same, irrespective of their need and circumstance, where equity really achieves this through treating people differently, dependent on need, circumstance, and consideration of historical and systemic inequities. Anti-racism for the college has been really a central theme of our work, and we believe it is the active and consistent process of change to eliminate individual, institutional, and systemic racism. This process involves examining and challenging societal structures and individual biases and belief systems that perpetuate racism and its power imbalances. And power here is a really critical piece of this conversation. Decolonial indigenization is very distinct to educational institutions, and it's really worth mentioning here because it is relevant to our context. It really envisions a wholesale overhaul of the academy to fundamentally reorient knowledge, production based on balancing power relations between Indigenous peoples and Canadians, really transforming the academy into something more dynamic and new. It's about really transforming our approaches to teaching, research, and administration, of course. Diversity, which is a common word that's always used by everyone, refers to the variety of similarities and differences among people, often called diversity dimensions. And that includes, but not limited to, gender identity and expression, ethnicity, race, age, disability, sexual orientation, religion, work style, job role and function, and personality types. Inclusion is really the dynamic state of feeling, belonging, and operating in which diversity is really leveraged and valued to create a fair, healthy, and high-performing organization or community. An inclusive culture and environment really ensures equitable access to resources and opportunities for all. It also enables individuals and groups to feel safe, respected, heard, engaged, motivated, and valued for who they are. So this idea of bringing your whole self to work. It's about employees feeling that they are valued members through experiencing treatment that satisfies their needs for belonging and uniqueness. Now, something that I feel very strongly about is intersectionality, and I don't think we get enough airtime around this, but it's the complex ways in which individuals hold many group affiliations at the same time. So these identities can combine, overlap, or intersect in a person or group, resulting in multiple interdependent systems of potential discrimination or oppression. And intersectionality really considers how our various diverse identities really combine and shape who we are and how we see the world. It's an understanding that different aspects of diversity do not exist separately or in isolation from each other. So I'll use an example. I'm young, ethnic female, so that's age, ethnicity, and gender, and they're weaved together to form my identity. I don't experience one without the other. So those are just kind of setting the stage for us to think about what those definitions actually mean. But let's really talk about why equity, diversity, and inclusion, just at the next slide there. And, the why conversation is always important because it drives us to think about purpose and how do we really have purpose-led organizations and communities. And so consider the kind of change you want to implement within your organization, how your role aligns with these values and how large your organization is. And ask the question, why are you choosing to implement this new strategy or set of initiatives? Why is it important to you? And the why really helps guide which elements are most important. So for example, if your why is making sure equity deserving or equity seeking groups have equal access to promotion, for example, in your organization, then equity is going to be a key element. If increasing diverse representation at all levels is an essential part of your strategy, then diversity will be key for you. If you strongly believe that diversity is just one essential component, that inclusion is what retains diverse talent, then inclusion will be a core part of your strategy. I think overall, reflect on which concepts or elements are more relevant to the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice goals of your organization. Trying to work towards this is a really great way to determine which terminology best suits you. Again, going back to language is very critical. And you'll see people use EDI, DEI, and they're all relevant, but really it's about prioritizing which elements you feel are more important to you. So at NorQuest, we believe in equity first, as we want to transform the role of education, providing greater access and opportunity to equity deserving, equity seeking groups. And we have made a commitment to anti-racism, as well as decolonial indigenization, as I kind of talked about it earlier. That's why we reference EDI as an acronym, as E is central to our strategy. So on to the next slide. I'm sure you've had these conversations at the tables that you've been sitting at, but there have been various drivers for embracing an EDI strategy, such as community leadership or moral ethical reason, social license to operate as an institution, depending on what kind of sector you're in, compliance with regulatory and legislative requirements, which HR departments really pay close attention to, but also it's about, generating goodwill and managing reputational risks. But the business case or the business imperative by far has been the key driver for most organizations. And there has been a very interesting and long history of evolution of thought leadership in this space. This isn't a flavor of the month. It's not something that's new. It's really been 40 years in the making. So that evolution is really important as context for us to understand how far we've come and how did it change over time, really to be relevant to the day to some extent, and really to understand the complexity of the space. So it's really interesting. We were doing some research in the 1970s. IBM was actually the first major corporation to engage in EDI, and they had some interesting workplace issues like high turnover, productivity, reduced sales, and so on. And they really felt that they wanted to legitimize women in the tech industry as well as Latina people. And so they asked two fundamental questions of their people. What are the barriers to working at IBM, and how do we put IBM computers on the desks of people like you? Very, very interesting business case there. And I think out of that, they really started to pave their path forward around this work. The most fundamental thing that happened in 1972, especially here in the province, is Peter Lougheed introduced the Individuals' Rights Protections Act and the Alberta Bill of Rights, which really formed the basis for Alberta's human rights legislative framework today. And so this was really the early genesis around human rights as it relates to sort of more around gender and sexual harassment. So that's kind of where things started a little bit. So it kind of aligns a bit with what IBM was trying to do as well. In the 80s, and a lot of people probably don't know this, but the Abella report, truly examined the employment inequity in Canada. It was a fundamental piece of work that was done that really paved a path forward and charted the employment way in a Canadian way by setting goals, but not really looking at affirmative action targets in the area of employment equity. So that's sort of the difference in language between Canada and say the US, because affirmative action is really common language in the US and it's systemic employment standards. And then we get into sort of the era of the 90s and the emergence of sort of corporate social responsibility programs. Diversity and inclusion was really seen as sort of that social responsibility piece. It's about community and really focused a bit on not seeing difference. And so we were told in the 90s to be colorblind, right? And not to see difference. And that was interesting because in the 2000s, with more refinement of diversity and inclusion into strategic plans and research and so on, there was more awareness of the value of difference and that being colorblind was not necessarily the way to go, but really to appreciate the uniqueness of each individual's as an opportunity to create really stronger diversity and inclusion strategies and organizations. In the 2010s, you could see sort of growing awareness for the need of equity and more specifically around the truth and reconciliation calls to action. And so a lot there started to sort of formulate more of the representation, the inclusion piece from cultural perspective, but really starting to pay more attention to the equity piece. And then you see that a decade later, and in the past couple of years, shifting to that equity piece as well, becoming more important around Black Lives Matter and structural changes with the sort of gender-based analysis plus and moving to sort of this anti-orientation, anti-oppression, anti-racism, social movements. And it's just, it's the shift from it's not enough to be not racist. We really needed to be active about being anti-racist and anti-oppressive. So the history there is so rich to tell us that this work continues to evolve and we continue to listen and learn to community. And we continue to build plans that adapt to that context and the environment as we really look into the future and have a foresight into how we want to move forward. So going on to the next slides, I'd love to just give you a snapshot of the regulative sort of framework and the legislations that have governed the space. Diversity and inclusion in the workplace are no longer optional. They are legal requirements now that we are beholden to. The human rights legislation prohibits discrimination based on those elements of diversity I talked about earlier, gender, race, ethnicity, and many other diversity and identity grounds. Also, the Canadian Employment Equity Act and the Federal Contractors Program require employers to take active measures to improve their employment opportunities for certain groups of people. So monitoring diversity becomes extremely crucial to really finding and highlighting inequities and inequalities and to gain valuable insights into the underlying causes of discrimination and bias. You've also probably heard a lot about psychological safety coming from HR departments and organizations. That's because in 2018, there was this direct link made between EDI and occupational health and safety. So you could kind of see things starting to link between existing legislative requirements. The Alberta Human Rights Act speaks to duty to accommodate, which is very important for us in a post-secondary environment, but overall it's a great policy. And the provincial codes and protected grounds lay out a very clear purpose to really foster a society in Alberta where there are no impediments to full and free participation in economic, social, political, and cultural life in Alberta. So a lot of these things have been able to really pave a path forward in terms of how policy influences organizational behavior in this space. And there's a lot more nuances around sort of federally regulated industries and defensible discriminations and so on. But it's really important for us to pay attention around some of this legislative and regulative environment that have really governed how organizations have behaved in this space. So to shift our thinking a little bit and think about sort of the frameworks used in this space, and there's a lot of models out there that have are great in their own right. The one that we use at NorQuest is a framework that's outlined in the work of Lopez and Thomas from the book Dancing on Live Embers. This is a really excellent document to read. This is more of a sort of organizational change approach, the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so above the line is where inclusion happens, sort of at that individual behavioral level, which is so important. At the end with that is we also need to look beneath the surface, and that's where we have hesitated to go in the past, and that's really where inequity lives in the system and culture below the line, right? One thing is true, though, around this triangle is it's really important that we, as we work with organizations, meet you where you're at, right? You could start somewhere on the triangle, but really make sure you get to the other ones as well. So it's really important. The individual behaviors can, just to kind of delve a little bit into the triangle, the individual behaviors can occur at the macro or micro level, right? And the systems, the things that govern the way things work in organizations, such as policies and procedures, forms and templates, space planning and design, employment systems like the onboarding process or the hiring process, communications, procurement, so on and so forth, can either entrench more inequity or really free up the space to offer more opportunity and hope for equity deserving groups. And culture. I mean, culture is a big driver around this work. It really sets the tone and addresses these sort of unconscious biases that we all hold, and really looks at the unexamined ideas within our organizations and the assumptions behind how we behave as a system, right? And it kind of calls out the elephants in the room sometimes, and it helps us sort of figure out how do we acknowledge some of these things, these underlying conditions and these powerful unassuming ideas so that we can re-examine culture more closely in organizations. So moving on to the next slide, how do we really move forward in this space? And so I thought it would be really powerful to share with you sort of the NorQuest journey, then pass it over to Evangeline to sort of share the Robert Half journey. So at NorQuest College, equity, diversity, and inclusion work has existed and been practiced at the college, I would say, for the past 20 years, and it took different forms, right? But however, we weren't operating under sort of an institution-wide approach until probably the last few years. And so what's different for us now is we're doing it in a more structured manner to make sure we're making measurable impact. NorQuest has served a very diverse learner base, from Indigenous learners, newcomers to Canada, international students, and that grassroots sort of learner base has really allowed us to think critically around how do we help understand the context in which these diverse communities operate within, and how do we understand the needs of those distinct communities that we serve, and how do we shift the paradigm and transform our system to serve them better. In 2007, which I think sort of where I've been able to find more historical evidence within the organization, I've been at NorQuest for almost 6 years. And so for me, it's being able to dig a little bit and understand more about our history. NorQuest started the Center for Intercultural Education, really paving a path forward for applied research projects for multi-million dollars over a period of 10 years, really working with organizations on intercultural competence, international and intercultural communications, and so on, supporting foreign trained professionals really gain a better insight into navigating the Canadian workplace. And this study was extremely powerful and really a strong partner with a lot of oil and gas companies, where you're recruiting this really skilled talent from overseas, but they haven't really had a chance to kind of get in and form their connections and communities. So a lot of the work in the center is really was trying to kind of help support that and really do some research around leading practices in this space. In 2017, so just jumping ahead about a decade, NorQuest was the first post-secondary institution admitted to sign the Colleges Institutes of Canada Indigenous Education Protocol. The college also answered the call to the Gord Downey and Cheney Wenjack Fund Legacy Room Project, in part by dedicating a very special space here at the college in memory of victims and to honor the survivors of the Indian residential schools. 2017 was a big year for us, so also NorQuest launched Wakotwin, which is our indigenization strategy, which has really sort of evolved to include an imperative for decolonial and Indigenization of the academy. In 2017, I initiated the Colbert Institute for Inclusive Leadership here at the college, which provides a wide range of services that encourages and supports organizations in developing and sustaining inclusive cultures through workshops, learning and development, culture assessment, strategy, development, applied research, and so on. It's really important for us to talk about measurement, and it's really important for us to talk about outcomes, right? And the global diversity, equity, and inclusion benchmarks is something worth mentioning here. It's an inventory and a measurement of best practices developed by a panel of about 92 international experts, which NorQuest was a panelist and a sponsor of the work, because we wanted to make sure there was an accessible, it's a free inventory that you could use, an accessible assessment for organizations that looks at the different categories of equity, diversity, and inclusion, to make sure that you're able to sort of examine where you're at in the organization. And even though there's a bit of a checklist in this, what's important about this assessment tool is not just to kind of go through the checklist, it's really about the conversations about the rankings within that checklist of like, that's a practice that we have versus it's a really great practice that we have. And so in sort of how do you look at building your capacity in that? For NorQuest specifically, we're going to focus on 3 categories, and those are the sort of foundational pieces in the plan, or foundational categories. The first is vision, strategy, and business impact. The second one is leadership and accountability. And the third one is EDI, structure and implementation. With the death of George Floyd a few years ago, it was really important for us as an institution to make a strong statement in the organization around our joint commitment to action on becoming an anti-racist organization and weaving equity work of anti-racism and indigenization with diversity and inclusion into the goal, strategies, and actions of the organization. So as we work towards that, the GDIB will really help us start to kind of measure that impact, because it's looking broader around the organizational practice and behavior. And I think it's exciting to be able to put in place things that we can stand behind and to see change happen over time. I will sort of wrap up the conversation here by sharing that back in the fall, NorQuest launched our new strategic plan, NorQuest 2030, We Are Who We Include, which has been fundamentally the voice of the college, saying this is where we see our vision collectively as an institution, as a community partner, as a place of work that we want to belong to, and we want to shape into what we want it to become. And within that, we've put some structural opportunities in place to establish an EDI office here at the college, as well as a safe disclosure office, to ensure that we have the systems in place to address equity. I would say further to that, we've created some power structures in the organization on having an equity, diversity, and inclusion council, and anti-racism working group that have been sort of the integration mechanism in the organization to ensure this work continues to be weaved throughout our practice. And this advisory body has been also the voice of change to the executive to make sure that our daily practice and our plans are inclusive of what we believe in and what we care for. So even though we've done a lot over the years, we still have work to do. And I'm very proud to be part of that work, and very excited to be that part of that work. And I look forward to, seeing your questions come. But for now, I'd love to pass it over to Evangeline to share the Robert Half journey. Thanks.
And thank you very much, Marianne. Very insightful discussion, and it's just a great topic. So just as a quick introduction for myself, I'm the Vice President, Strategic Accounts for Alberta with Robert Half. Been with Robert Half for 16 years, and just really looking forward to chatting with you further here and kind of sharing our journey. So now, before I begin, you will notice our slides reference EDI as DEI. So at Robert Half, we use the acronym DEI for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We felt that it was important to show how different organizations, may use different nomenclature, but the spirit of their journey may still align on many levels. And Marianne touched on this in her discussion as well. And this too is really, one could say, an example of inclusion. So in the, sorry, my allergies are very bad today. So in the following slides, I'm going to speak to what Robert Half has learned through employer surveys, discussions with our clients, our own journey, and discussions we have had with experts in this field as it relates to meaningful inclusion, what diversity brings to organizations. We will also highlight a DEI checklist, and then we will end with Robert Half's DEI journey. So across the country, we're seeing more organizations are integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion into their policies, hiring practices, and corporate culture. Not only is it the right thing to do, but it gives companies access to a broader range of skill sets and experiences. And while diverse hiring practices bring a range of backgrounds into a company, it doesn't automatically create meaningful inclusion. Inclusion really happens when employees, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, feel safe and supported to be their authentic selves at work, are treated equitably and have equal access to opportunities to move ahead in the company, are recognized and are valued parts of the team, no matter their background or role, and have a voice and know that they're being heard. These are key to a healthy workplace. Unless workers feel safe, supported, and valued, employers are really missing the spirit of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, a diverse leadership team brings broader perspectives, deeper experiences, and greater inclusivity, which makes them better at problem solving, decision-making, and innovation, which in today's business environment is absolutely critical. And leadership sets the tone, and companies in Canada are beginning to act and make a difference. 63% of senior managers reported that diversity in their company's leadership has increased in the last 5 years. And companies are taking a variety of actions on the DEI front. They are more aggressively creating programs and policies to ensure all employees are treated with respect and empathy. They are making DEI a key part of their organizational culture, and in the process, creating an atmosphere of belonging. They are providing greater transparency into hiring and retention practices, and for benchmarking and accountability, and again, Marianne touched a bit on this as well, they are measuring DEI efforts and communicating them to their employees as well as the community. So now let's talk a little bit more about our journey at Robert Half. So DEI is not new at Robert Half. Ever since Bob and Maxine Half founded the company back in 1948, We have been guided by high ethical standards and a desire for positive change in the employment industry. In the 1960s, Bob Half testified before the US Congress, speaking against discriminatory practices in hiring that were common at the time. And today, we continue our commitment to advancing DEI across our company and in the communities where we live and work. Now, employee training plays a major role in establishing an environment of understanding and belonging within an organization. Diversity, equity, and inclusion training itself begins by providing staff with education on understanding unconscious bias awareness. Addressing unconscious bias is an important step within the Robert Half to truly support our commitment to equity and inclusion. Our teams are provided with interactive, thought-provoking materials that are aimed to help foster understanding and a sense of belonging among our teams. It's vital that we have a sense of what our blind spots are as individuals. What we perhaps don't even realize is a racialized act or a marginalizing comment. By learning that we all have opportunities to be more understanding and inclusive, we are better able to encourage those around us to do the same in our day-to-day as hiring managers, colleagues, and leaders. And I was hoping to provide a sense of how Robert Half, for example, is creating a culture of inclusion and belonging. We're definitely not perfect at this, and we definitely want to put that out there. But our DEI program is something that is always evolving. Even now, we're working to define what our global DEI lens looks like and how to create a unified goal across cultures, context, and geographies, particularly in light that we are a global firm. Now, I wanted to introduce our employee network groups, or ENGs, which play a key role in how we create organic and safe spaces for groups of common interests. They're led entirely voluntarily by passionate and motivated individuals across our global Robert Half offices. And for any organization looking to promote diversity and gain insight into what is important to minority groups within their organization, ENGs provide an incredible space to facilitate and encourage that. Pictured on the slide are the primary ENGs currently operating within Robert Half. And ENGs are represented by employees from traditional underrepresented groups and allies who support these groups, as well as people who share a common purpose, interest, or background. And together they form a global network of culturally, generationally diverse experts aligned to the company vision and provide a forum to encourage inclusion and diversity among employees at all levels. They do this through addressing company-wide challenges, building internal support systems, promote leadership and development at all ranks, and support Robert Half's efforts to attract and retain top talent. Another key component of our DEI program is our focus on affiliations and local partnerships with diversity groups. We're currently building out our partnership program in Canada, but in the past year, we participated in more than 75 external diversity-related events in the US and Canada, including virtual diversity career fairs, workshops, conferences, summits, and a lot of the workshops were organized by groups where we have affiliations. An example of which in Edmonton, for example, would be ERIC. Inclusion programs and partnerships are vital for an organization to integrate with the underrepresented communities that make up even their own employee base, and to better understand the needs and accessibility requirements of groups that may not otherwise work with you. Again, revealing our bias is only possible by understanding our blind spots, and often we learn best by listening and educating ourselves through outreach. Now, being a socially responsible corporate citizen and an active participant in the communities where we operate is a cornerstone of our mission statement. and a huge focus for Robert Half. And we further integrate DEI into every fiber of our organization. We have been recognized for our inclusion and diversity initiatives, as you'll see several company accolades on the slide. And it's through things like our charitable initiatives and our supplier inclusion program that made these recognitions possible. Supplier inclusion is a corporate-wide initiative designed to support the promotion, growth, and development of small and/or minority, women, veteran, disabled veteran, and LGBTQ-owned businesses. We also require our suppliers to use fair labor practices and support diversity through our supplier code of conduct and our global human rights policy. And from a community partnership perspective, inclusion remains paramount. Our focus in Canada currently is through a national charitable partnership program that provides monetary and voluntary support to organizations like Inspire, which is in support of Indigenous education, the Canadian Mental Health Association, and the United Way across Canada. So this summarizes a bit of our DEI journey at Robert Half. And as mentioned, our work and understanding as an organization in this area will only continue to evolve and grow. And with that, again, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion today. We would look forward to answering any questions you may have. As mentioned, if you haven't already added your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom, please do. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then we can start looking at some of those questions. All right, so Farzan. Hello again, this is Farzan from Toronto, Ontario. Hello, Farzan. Good to hear from you again. I have been with Robert Half since doing work placements with Office Team from 2006 to 2008, and still doing business office financial administration courses online with our skill port, which is great tool. I use it all the time myself. I have a question relating to EDI, and my question is, how does EDI have to do with the office environment, and what policies could all of us do in order to maintain ourselves in this office environment?
I can take that
Sure.
eventually if you want me to start, and happy to.
Go ahead, please.
For sure. So thank you so much for your question. It's a really excellent one. So, what are the examples of why, I guess, in the workplace for equity, diversity, inclusion? I'm happy to share with you some of the research findings. So in one study, inclusive leaders led to a 70% increase in feelings of fairness, respect, valued, belonging, psychological safety, and inspiration, things we all need, want, and deserve at work. When individuals feel that, also leads to improved team performance by about 17%. And you see an increase of 20% around decision-making quality. And you also need to see 29% increased collaboration across teams. Another study have found that organizations with inclusive cultures are 2 times more likely to meet or exceed their financial targets, are 3 times more likely to be high performing, are 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile, and achieve their business outcomes. So you can see that some of the research findings are super clear, that EDI is good for people, teams, and business. So it shows up in the workplace in really cool ways. You've got innovation happening, you've got higher engagement, you've got better performance, and so on. So that's how it usually shows up. And policies and procedures are very unique to organizations. And as anything, it's a system that we must all examine. And I think identifying specifically what needs to happen after that assessment takes place, and that examination takes place of your current system. And the GDIB that I talked about earlier has some really great tools in there to help you sort through that.
Perfect, thank you. And that was a great, very comprehensive answer, Marianne. So I don't know if I can add too much more, but I do just think that looking at diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, or in the case of NorQuest, equity, diversity, and inclusion, however your organization looks to frame it and build out their plans and programs, I think it's an absolute win-win from a number of different ways. For the employees, it again just provides just tremendous satisfaction in their work environment. You'll see people, excel because they feel like they belong, they feel safe. They can come to work as their authentic best selves. And in that, it's only going to help their teams, it's going to help them, their families, and it's going to help the business. And so really, there's just so many great, amazing things that can come out of these initiatives and these programs. And so, it's a really exciting time that we're, evolving and continuing to do more of these things.
Yeah, those were great comments, right? Because it's about success in your role, essentially.
Yeah.
We want people to come and feel success in their role, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because then it just gives success in every aspect of their life, which everybody, I think the pandemic has really highlighted that to people, that, we all want balance, and we want to be happy, not only in our jobs or feel success in our jobs, but also have that at home. And that is possible. And that's what these programs are really looking to help us achieve. So that really answers the questions that we had so far. Does anyone else have anything they may have? Please put it in the chat. It's just one of the other questions was, where is NorQuest College? So we answered that question. Because we're happy to answer any other questions. But I also really encourage people, if maybe you're not comfortable asking a question on the webinar today, you can absolutely reach out to Marianne or myself, and we'll be happy to address any of your questions after the webinar. Did you have any maybe closing comments you want to share, Marianne?
I see a question that just came in the chat. Do you want to?
Sure. Okay. There we go. What key challenges do you envisage, in implementing EDI or DEI in the future?
Yeah, 3 things top of mind, and Evangeline, please feel free to supplement that as well. I think one of the things is really lack of actionable data and resources. That's a huge piece for a lot of organizations. 2, I think a heavy reliance on employee resource group leaders and putting that emotional burden, excuse me, on those employee resource groups to do a lot of the work and the heavy lifting versus the leadership in the organization. And 3, sort of lack of focus on integrating EDI across the employee experience, really thinking critically about how do they see your organization before they even think about wanting to work for you. What does the selection recruitment process look like? What does the onboarding look like? What does the performance reviews look like? How does the goal setting look? And all this really big piece to, even as you exit the organization, what is that feeling that you get as part of your employee experience? So I think those I see as fundamental challenges. And a lot of organizations are not strangers to this, right? And I think you see it across the systems.
Yeah, no, and that's all great points. And just to build off of that, Marianne, so looking at the holistic kind of end-to-end employee experience, building that out with that, but then also, I think, something that organizations will continue to work with and really embrace is living if you say you're an ethics first organization, for example, and you have some of these diversity, equity, inclusion, or EDI sorts of initiatives, you're living them and in everything you do. So not only with your employees, but you're living it with your policies, with external vendors. You're looking to them to demonstrate that they also have similar aligned value systems. When you are, signing up contracts, are those contracts, in any way contradictory to, any of those EDI or DEI initiatives? Because it really is a very holistic mindset, and it's not checking a box. And I think over time, it's amazing once you actually really start to think through how this permeates, like this mindset, and trying to evolve and go on this journey. You'll see how it permeates into absolutely everything a company does, everything that that company touches, their community, everything. And so I think the challenge will be is that's big. It's a lot. So that's why I think a lot of this will definitely be an evolution. There's going to be, you're going to take chunks of it at a time and see how, how you can learn from that and then just add on something else and add on something else. And, kind of further, I think, to what Marianne had illustrated as she went through and showed some of the history behind, where we've been back in the 70s and where were we in the 90s. And you see societal attitudes change, which will also just help with that evolution. And it'll help with some of the adoption side of it as well. People kind of being able to understand how important this is. So yeah.
Yeah, I want to double down on one of the comments that you said is this: we have to be careful not to become performative in this space. And really, that's why it's so important to ask the question, why are you doing it? And can you walk the talk when you decide to do it? And I think that's an important piece of it. So yeah, great comments. Thank you.
Yeah. Great question. Thank you, Benjamin. Any other questions? All right. Looks like that might be it. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. And again, the recording is going to be available. So, please do share it with colleagues, with people in your community. And again, we're happy to answer any questions outside of this webinar as well. Both Marianne and I are on LinkedIn. So you can absolutely link up with us. I'm going to just speak for you there, Marianne. You can jump in if you
For sure. Happy to. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, we look for, I know we're both very excited about this, and we hope it came through in our discussion with you today and left you with some thought-provoking sorts of things and maybe some action items. Over you to Marianne.
Yeah, no, a pleasure, and wonderful to kind of have a bit of a back and forth between you and I, Evangeline, which is really great. I think we've got good thought leadership there between NorQuest and Robert Half. So thanks everybody for joining us, and really appreciate your comments and questions today. That was really wonderful, and look forward to follow up if you need to. Of course, I know Robert Half is planning to send out a follow-up email with the recording, as well as contact information for Evangeline and I. So happy to connect and discuss further. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.